Okay with you?
Thanks so much.
All right. So,
yeah. All right, then. Over to you then, David. Thank you.
Okay. Good afternoon, folks. Thanks for joining us this time on a Friday afternoon. What I've been asked to do today is an overall kind of prevent update stroke training session to a degree for those who have either are not aware of prevent. I know some of you will be, so I'll probably cover some of the bits that some of you will be aware, but there is some context to this. I will be talking about as we go through the current risk, so that's an update. And the overall context, though, is around to remember, and I'll highlight when we're discussing it, but there is new prevent guidance, which I'll mention when I'm covering this. I'm not using the training package. I've got a training package just for that, but I'm going to mention some of those salient points in this because we want to do a little bit more of a broader prevent discussion today. The new prevent guidance is very much led by an independent review of prevent, which was carried out by a gentleman called William Shawcross at the beginning of the year, who made a series of recommendations. It was a little bit of a controversial document and review in that it was the work of one man rather than a group of politicians or academics joining together. But he made 34 recommendations. Those recommendations are accepted fully by the Home Secretary at the time. I know that's changed, and the Home Office. And there is a team working in the Home Office on that now. So I will cover that. I'm from the Department for Education. I'm a civil servant. I've been doing this job now for 6 years. My job is to support the education sector in the East of England in its prevent duty, to act as a link into the regional prevent network, which is kind of managed by local authorities and the police, to be kind of a representative of the sector on relevant prevent boards, etc. And also to act as a bit of a conduit for organisations and schools, institutions and organisations like yourself into the Department for Education in the small team. I'm part of a small team in the counter-terrorism and non-school division. So with that, I've got the chat bar on, folks. If you want to ask a question as we're going through, you can put your hand up. I mean, we're a nice small group. You all know each other, so I'm sure it's a trusted conversation. But if you want to type something in the chat bar, that's not a problem either. We can do that as we go along. We may have a couple of minutes at the end, but sometimes people like to ask questions as we go through, so we can keep the context and keep the flow of the presentation going. So that's up and running for yourselves. So prevent, a quick reminder for those of you who are prevent aware, or an update for those of you who aren't. It is part of the government's contest strategy. This slide is a couple of weeks out of date because I'm talking about it being updated, and as I've indicated, there is a new guidance which came out in September. That guidance, just so we're aware, like I say, is an upshot of the prevent review. The prevent review said we need new guidance. Because the world of prevent is changing, as you can see there, June 2018, so 5 years ago since the last guidance, we needed that new sense of guidance. So that is one of the changes, and I'll highlight as we're going through this some of the changes that guidance will articulate. The guidance kicks in actually on December the 31st. In essence, it comes into place in the new year. Danny, if you haven't, I've sent links to that, but those of you who are involved in safeguarding, I would suggest you have a look at the new guidance at some point between now and then. The links can all be found on Educate Against Hate. I'll throw the plug in for that now. Educate Against Hate, for all of you to be aware of, is the Department for Education's Prevent website. You will say, well, he's going to promote it because he is from the Department for Education, but I'm a strong believer that actually it's the best prevent website, best government website there is. If you want to know something about prevent, it will be on there. There is a further education. It looks a little bit schooly, or it has been historically. There is a further education sector now. We're looking to develop a higher education sector. There's a parent sector. Like I say, if you've got a query or you want to find a link to something to do with prevent, that's the place to go. Danny, you'll find guidance on there, and also the link to the new risk assessments and documents like that if you want to have a look at them. So it is part of the contest strategy. It's part of the government's counter-terrorism strategy. It is a safeguarding thing, as we'll mention, but that's where it falls. It falls under counter-terrorism. So it is aligned to, it is one of the 4 Ps, and it's aligned to the others we can see there. Pursue, protect, prepare. Pursue is the easy one to describe because it's the one that does what it says on the tin. I don't know how you all get your news. There's various ways now, isn't there? You can be an oldie and just buy a newspaper. You can get rolled in news, or you can get your news from social media, or a mixture of all. But you will be aware that at any given point in time, there are individuals and organisations out there with ideas which they want to promote, and they'll use violence to do that. So that's an act of terrorism, to use violence to support an idea or cause, whether that's ideological, it'll be ideological, whether it's religious, political, philosophical, or whatever that cause is. If you want to support an act of violence, or you're going to commit an act of violence, you will fall into the terrorism reign. To stop that, there are agencies, primarily the police, but other agencies, security agencies, who will try and either disrupt those who are doing that, or when they can, arrest them as well. So, Sue, I've worked in, like I say, in this job for 6 years. I was working in CT policing for about 8 years before that in Prevent. I've always referred to that as the dark side. It's clearly a specialised area of work. All these areas do link in, though. There will be links, obviously, as you'd understand, between all of them at some point. Protect is a very large piece of work which goes on to if we are aware that there are attacks or people who want to attack us, and bearing in mind, for the risk assessment at the moment, the UK terrorist threat level sits at substantial, which sits in the middle of the terrorist on a 1 to 5 scale. It's on level 3. But if it's substantial, that tells us that the government believes that a terrorist attack is likely. So if we believe that, it is inherent duty on any government to look how to protect. How do we make it harder for people to commit terrorist attacks on the UK? That's really been brought to the fore by Martin's Law. Some of you may be aware of that. It's developed from the horrific attack in the Manchester Arena at the Ariana Grande concert. What could have been done to make it physically harder for that attack to occur? And there's a piece of legislation going through Parliament which is going to give further guidance on that. And hopefully we will have an update, although it's not Prevent as such. When that legislation goes through, there will be links on various government websites, and hopefully we'll be advertising that in things like newsletters to make people aware. But it is very impactful. I mean, I'm looking at you, Daniel, and you look far too young, any of you on here, to have travelled on a plane like I did in the 70s, when really you rocked up at the airport, you got rid of your luggage, and you basically fought to get the best seat. We all know getting onto an airplane is far more complicated, and we all know why that is. And that's part of our duty to protect. It's a big thing, that security. But it invades us in more ways than we realise, actually. If you go up to London and you go around any of the certainly any government buildings over the last 5 to 10 years, there are the black bollards. They're not there for people to chain their bikes to. They're there because they will stop a truck being driven up onto a pavement or into a building. And if you go around the Houses of Parliament, there was a small memorial where a police officer was killed in just such an attack. But it's also, if you used a train of late, I often use trains to get around a region and for some longer journeys, and you repeatedly get those messages, don't you? See it, say it, sorted. That is all part of that. If you see something suspicious, what are you to do? Say it, report it. That is all to protect. It's to make it and make our environment safer, to reduce the opportunities for those who want to attack. Prepare is the large overall emergency planning. Every organisation has an emergency plan to cover everything from your building leaking down to your computers cutting out. The government tried to have a plan, same as they would for a railway crash or an airplane crash. What happens if an attack occurs at a location? And they will hold drills, and they will talk with different departments about how they would liaise, how they would communicate, where meeting points would be. So that's another ongoing piece of work that's done by the government. So pursue, protect and prepare. I think if we were sitting in a room and I said to you, I'm going to make you Prime Minister for the day, what would you do about terrorism? We would all write something along those lines. We're going to go after the bad guys. We're going to make it harder. We're going to protect people. They are all things which are sound very simple. They're complicated to do, but we would expect the government at any time to do. that for us. Prevent is different in that it's about safeguarding those who are vulnerable to radicalisation. The people we are talking about, this is primarily in a pre-criminal space, a non-criminal space. These are talking about safeguarding individuals who we feel may be susceptible, and that is the key word now. One of the things from the Prevent review and in the guidance, we vulnerability, clearly people are vulnerable, but it's are they susceptible to being drawn into terrorism? I'll cover that a little bit more in a minute. So the main driver from that, really, when Prevent got its first boost, was the attacks on the tubes and the trains in London, which was a wake-up call. We hadn't seen such an attack in the United Kingdom, and questions was asked, what was it inspired those young men, and what could have been done to stop them being drawn into that level of violence before they'd actually gone out or been encouraged to do it. So Prevent is, as we say there, a community safeguarding program. We're looking to safeguard individuals who may be susceptible to being drawn into terrorism or non-violent extremism via non-violent extremism, non-violent extremism in and of itself, not a Prevent issue, but have an ideology where they will go further. We'll cover some of that. So Prevent duty, just to reiterate, covers all can cover all forms of ideology and violence, and we've got some there, and I'll cover the main risks in a minute, but we can see somewhere clearly we can see what the terrorist aims are, but we can also see some there. We've got the Animal Liberation Front, which in and of itself is not a terrorist organisation, but we have seen people who have been drawn into, and I'll explain it further around the ideology, but the threat of violence or to use violence for an aim. If that was the case, whatever the ideology, we would say, right, drawn into the terrorism world, it's potentially for Prevent to support individuals if we were concerned. In the police like to kind of refer to Prevent, in the term they use is agnostic. It doesn't actually, Prevent doesn't actually name or say what type of ideology it will deal with. There are prescribed terrorist groups, that's different, but we would look at any concern where we feel people are being drawn into violence. So just to cover that, and we'll cover that a little bit more. So it's always had these three elements, and that first one responds to the ideological challenge of terrorism and aspects of extremism, has been highlighted in the independent, it was highlighted in the independent review, and it is a main driver of some of the new parts of the guidance. What was happening, or what William Shawcross, the reviewer, said over the last few years, he had concerns that Prevent was being drawn into safeguarding in general. It was going too far. To be a Prevent referral or a concern, there had to be an issue of ideology. If there isn't, it's not a Prevent concern. I don't think it's a change. I think it's what it is a reiteration. It's an emphasising the core function of Prevent. He felt it was being drifting too far. Like I say, it was controversial. I think there are elements of truth around that, though. I think it's got to be said. That ideological component, it can be confusing, though, or it can be hard to draw out at times. It is easy if the individual or the concern that's been raised around an individual relates to an ideology or a group which is encouraging violence in and of itself. So if there was if somebody was becoming interested in a terrorist organisation, whatever the ideology was, and that group were calling for violence, that's clearly a Prevent concern, as long as that person hasn't crossed over certain lines. So if somebody is supporting an Al-Qaeda narrative or an ISIS narrative, an IRA narrative, a terrorist prescribed organisation, we can see they call for violence, they use violence. That is pretty cut and dried that there's going to be a Prevent concern. Where it becomes harder to spot at times, and I've used Animal Liberation Front as an example, so if we stick with animal rights for now, is if Prevent doesn't, and the new guidance is clear on this, doesn't cover non-violent extremism. Again, if we'd all sat down and when we'd done that, I'd said I'd made you Prime Minister for the day, what are you going to do? And we'd all shared those anonymously. I'm fairly sure there would have been some shaking of heads. Crikey, that seems a bit extreme. We all hold views which others may call extreme. No, not violent views, but they're extreme. to some people. So to some people who I think we all have a belief that animal welfare is a strong point, but some people get drawn into that cause and it becomes a cause how they live their life, what they eat, what they wear, how they go about in the world, it can be affected in their belief in animal rights. That's non-violent extremism to a degree. If they support some organisations, that's not a prevent concern. That's not an issue. Somebody who's has a strong opinion on that, it's not an issue unless that individual starts to indicate, or there is a belief that they are supporting or they would support violence for that cause. They turn around and say, look, nothing's changing, animals are still suffering. I think that farm there, or they breed those animals, should be attacked, or I would support people who would do that. So there is an ideology there, although it's non-violent, where somebody would be willing to support violence for it. That again would fall under prevent, because it would fall under the domain of terrorism. And it's that call for arms for a cause which defines prevent, not a use of violence in and of itself. And just to highlight that, where we've seen some misunderstandings. We had a school, and it wasn't in the Eastern region. It related to a 16-year-old, so not too far off the age that you could well be dealing with. This young person had a range of real issues. There were some clear safeguarding concerns, and there were concerns about violence. The school did a really detailed report to the prevent team in the county. It wasn't in Bedfordshire. That prevent team contacted me and said, we need some help with this. We've looked at this. We won't tell you what the problem is. Have a look at it. And I had a look, and there were real concerns, real concerns. That child needed support. He was threatening violence, but it was all domestic related. He was either threatening family or friends. It needed sorting, but there was no cause to that. We had to go back to the school and say, this isn't a prevent issue. And they said, but this person is threatening violence. And it was a very hard and uncomfortable conversation around, yes, but it doesn't fall in ours. We can signpost it, or the police said we will, signpost it to mental health, and the school was saying, well, we've spoke to them, but they can't do a lot more. And we had to push that back. Now, I know many of you will be dealing with vulnerable individuals and come across some of those issues. That's a really uncomfortable conversation. But the prevent review highlighted that he felt this was happening too much, where things were going, nobody was doubting there were safeguarding issues, but he says that's got to have that ideological element for it to come in prevent. So I think that re-emphasis will cause more further difficult conversations at times. But if we're aware at the beginning, we will kind of hopefully, because we're getting to a stage where in some parts of the region, we're getting almost 50% of prevent referrals are being rebuffed by the police who triage it, saying there isn't an ideological issue, or we haven't identified. Sometimes that can be the context of the referral, perhaps hasn't been explored or explained, but we need to emphasise that. So that ideological part is being re-emphasised and is important. So the other part of prevent is the other parts are to provide practical help, and I'm going to discuss that in a minute, the channel panel. It's no good doing this unless we've got a practical help, a way of helping people, on the channel panel, so that. And it is the part of the contest strategy which clearly works. All of those other parts, there are clearly wide-ranging partnership working, but this is the one that probably works most in the public domain. It's a public sector duty. So local authorities, every public sector agency has a prevent responsibility. Health, probation, we all do. We all come together and we all discuss these issues to support individuals if we've got those concerns. We would support those individuals via the channel panel. So if you make a prevent referral, and it goes to and now it used to go to the local authority in Luton. We used to be part of what we called a dovetail site. It was dealt with by the local authority, and down here I think that was the case when you made some referrals. It was primarily dealt with by Luton Borough Council, which is a bit bizarre, but they had the funding for it. That's changed. Those models have changed. It's gone back to the police. The police now are that initial call, and they triage it. If they decide that yes, they look at it and the referral, and we've done the right work, we've done the context building, we showed what the ideology is, they will talk to other agencies, social services, health, those who have got responsibility, and they will take that to the channel panel to support that. All that is, folks, is the same as any other multi-agency safeguarding board. It's no different. than that, because we're supporting, we're not criminalising. This isn't an investigation into the individual. It's looking about how can we support that individual and draw them away from being taken into a path of violence. We need to look at their susceptibility, and that susceptibility, as we've kind of looked at an ideology, is that they're supporting an ideology of violence, or they support a cause where their own beliefs would allow violence to be used. So they're susceptible to terrorism. If there's not a susceptibility to it, there's not an ideology, it's not a prevent review. That's very clear in the new guidance. I just want to highlight a couple of things about the channel program. Firstly, it's voluntary, and that sounds very strange. We've got a prevent referral, you've made it. Somebody will have to engage with that person before they go fully onto the channel panel and say, we want to support you. Now, I was involved, one of my jobs in the police back in 2012, when it became a statutory duty, was in setting up channel panels. And I thought it's going to be a strange job because people will say no, but they don't. About 90% of people who are approached by channel through a channel panel approach, really 95% say yes. The other 5% sometimes signpost to other organisations to look at the risk, but 95% of the time people will, because what will be decided initially is with the police. From your referral, they will liaise with you and other agencies. Who is the trusted professional who can talk to that person? Could be yourselves, could be the police, but most of the best prevent referrals I've seen over the years, it's the schools, it's the doctors, it's the agencies, social services who are working with those individuals and say, we're really concerned about some of the comments you've said or something you've written or what we're hearing about you. We want to support and engage you. And people do. Now, there's a lot of discussion around that. Why would people do that? There's discussions as to whether it's cognitive dissonance. People have got these extreme views, but they're still at this early stage holding more open values, softer values that they may have from their parents or other friends. And they're in a competition. They're holding two sets of views at a time and they want to explore. And I think that's very often the case because we're dealing early on. Remember, we want these referrals early when we can. Or I think sometimes it's a case of confidence, overconfidence. I've got these extreme set of views. I want to discuss them. I'll tell you, you're going to send somebody to discuss with me and I'll do it. So it's voluntary, though. They have to agree, but that works. The other thing, it's confidential. And you're sitting there going, well, Dave, you just said you shared it, or half a dozen organisations or not. And we do. But it's the level that it's shared at. It's like your organisation, isn't it? If you had that concern, the people who would know would be Danny, the safeguarding lead, and possibly one or two other members of staff. It's not always necessarily widely shared. It's shared where it needs and appropriate. It's confidential. It goes to the police team and they do the same. That is kept within the prevent policing team. They do the checks. They will talk to the health service. They will talk to social service. And it's within a few small individuals who are basically sitting on the panel who will do those checks. It doesn't go any further. It's no need to, unless there was a real big safeguarding issue where, we found a real weakness and there was a mental health issue and it needed to be explored further. Probably, though, if that was the case, it would be signposted to that agency or they would take over the ownership of the prevent referral. Rare, but it happens. But it remains confidential. Just to reinforce that, just say you had a young person, you'd make that referral and they're in Bedford one night and something kicks off near them and the police turn up and they get out and they're just name checking people. They do the old P&C checks and they speak to that young person. It doesn't flag up, but they're on channel. There's no need to. It's not on the police national computer. It shouldn't be. It wouldn't be there. So it stays confidential within the prevent network. And they are important safeguards because once it's gone to channel cases normally take 3 to 6 months. They're looking at reducing the risks of that young person. And it normally takes 3 to 6 months to do that. They will come off what they call channel. Normally a review takes place after that, after a year. If that's all done, that's finished. That's the way it stays. It shouldn't travel with that person. It's not like others. It can do. Any information could be shared while that person's on channel. And at times there can be information if that person is deemed extremely vulnerable, even as they're growing older. Sometimes that information can be shared just to make sure this has happened to this person once. But on the whole, once that's finished, that's stopped. So it's voluntary and it's confidential. And that should reassure us, those who are working with, we've called to take away this, are we spying on people? No, we're not. We're supporting individuals with a voluntary and confidential system. So the guidance reinforces that. It's very strong. The new guidance around information sharing. Certainly if somebody's on prevent or in prevent and on channel, the information should be shared completely as any other safeguarding issue. Right. So yeah, where we stand in 2023, it hasn't changed much over the years. It's assessed that a likely terrorist attack would come from self-initiated terrorists. All that means, that is the method. It's not what is happening, it's how we see terrorist attacks occurring globally, but certainly in the Western world, where an individual will go out, and we used to refer to them as lone actors, didn't we? Self-initiated terrorists, and they go out and they will commit a terrorist attack on their own. That we know, and that's part of that is another thing that the guidance accepts and changes. The threat level has changed, or is changed shape, in that a lot of this now is due to the online world. Actually, I haven't seen a case of radicalization occur for the last 5 or 6 years at least, and certainly at channel panels, and I get to most of them, where the individual, even at the prevent stage, their driving force is they're either getting information from the internet or and viewing it themselves, or they're getting supplied by other individuals on the internet. They've formed relationships, and that has changed how this works. So we see those individuals feeling, when they go out to commit an attack, as part of an organization. I think one of the things we're beginning to understand, aren't we? We talk about the internet as if it's always been there. Some of us can remember the pre-internet world, but really, it was a great source. We saw it as a great source of information. But what we perhaps didn't realise, even 10 years ago, is this social side, the networking side. And many people, especially young people, their relationships are online. And you know, a lot of your students have got relationships with people online who they will never meet, are just as important as the relationship as the person standing next to them. And that's how these individuals, when they go out to commit the attacks, they don't feel they're on their own. They feel they are acting as a vanguard, part of a network, and they are going out. And that's for all forms of terrorism. Certainly something we've seen pushed by the extreme far right, young people getting drawn in around that. Go out, armies of one, go out and commit these attacks. You can see what the two main threats are. I'm going to cover them in a little bit more detail in a minute. But certainly that's recognised in the new guidance. And certainly if we're talking about online safety, prevent's always one of those issues we should be discussing. Are people really aware? Because we always get to me. I've never met a young person yet who says, yeah, I'm vulnerable online. According to every young person, now you can tell me, I'm safe. If that's the case, how come we still see people being drawn into terrorism online? We know that occurs. I think what people don't understand sometimes, it's not they're going to get attacked. It's the danger is of when them putting a view out there and people encouraging and supporting them, which can be just as worrying and harder to stop. So we've identified on that, and I'm going to cover this in the next slide or so. The government still tell us what the two main threats are at the moment, what are the two biggest risks. And the biggest one they estimate is acts of Islamist terrorism. Now, I know that's an uncomfortable term for many people. OK, but the independent reviewer of Prevent said it's been used for a long time. He believed it is the correct term and said that is the term to use. The Home Office have said that is the term we'll use. So as a civil servant, that is the term I have to use. OK, but what we will say, just to remind people, we're on about a very small group of individuals here. We're on about acts of terrorism, as you can see, perpetrated or inspired by politically, religiously motivated groups or individuals who support and use violence as a means to establish their interpretation of a caliphate. We're on about a very small number of people who would support groups like Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and groups like that. OK, that is the drive. That is the small number of people. But we can clearly see that. And when I talk about ideologies, it's an ideology of violence. So if we've got people who support that ideology of violence, they're clearly going to fall into Prevent because their ideology calls for acts of violence. So the police, and it's the police who decide, well, it's an organisation called JTAC. It's a coming together of all government departments. They decide and they say the threat from Islamist terrorism remains primarily the ability of extremist groups to radicalise others, particularly vulnerable. We should be changing that word to susceptible now, online. And it is that ability. The people we are seeing radicalised for this are online. And the young man there, as you'll be reading it, is a classic example of a modern day terrorist. Young Matthew there, he was 19 when he was sentenced to July. So he's got a discretionary life sentence. He must serve 6 years, but he's got a discretionary life sentence. He's a terrorist. He always will be. Just bear that in context, though. When Matthew first started these issues, he was only 16 stroke 17, bordering on 18. A lot of his offence was committed when he was a child, under 17. He converted, but his conversion to a faith was done by online with a small group of people who held an Islamist mindset. So that was his worldview. He never developed anything else. That was his mind view. His relationships were all formed. My understanding of the reading, when I read about this conviction in the newspapers, he even had a girlfriend who he'd never met online who encouraged him around these beliefs. So Matthew gets these beliefs, and sadly, it's not noticed at first, you know, and every time I see some of these young people, it's a failure. I think we missed it. How do we miss him? We did. And he'd started to plan an attack because he was being encouraged by others online. That was a true calling. And he'd started to do that. At some point, his parents become concerned and they report him to the authorities. And again, if I'm led to believe from what I read in the media, even some local mosques had heard of this young man and some of the comments, and they said, we're really concerned about what this person's saying. The police go to look at it as a prevent issue. Sadly, Matthew started to plan an attack. He's lost that. It's gone too far. It's gone into that dark side. So he's arrested and he's now a live terrorist. He's never been in trouble before. You know, to me, they were revealing, where did we fail? Why didn't we spot that before? That person being drawn into that far. Part of the problem was it was totally online. You know, and we see more and more. Well, we don't. This is how we see acts of terrorism occurring by young individuals primarily, and that's the other change we're seeing. And that's one of the things that is very, very obvious. Now, as I say, I've been doing this for a long time. When I was 10 years ago, the vast majority of prevent referrals, if there were 10 prevent referrals, probably only 2 or 3 involved people under 17, perhaps 3 or 4 under 25. Most were kind of 25, but they were adults. 67 of prevent referrals in Bedfordshire over the last year, I think, yeah, over the last year, have been under 24. 40% have been children. One of the effects of what we've seen on the internet and the way these organisations work has been a change in the demographic, and we are seeing people being drawn into these terrorist networks at a far younger age than we were used to. It's causing a lot of questions. It's a real challenge for counter-terrorism policing. They're dealing with children, which they never used to. You know, so that's causing them real issues, and they're learning and they're dealing with young people who are planning attacks online. And we've certainly seen that growth across all forms of extremism. It's very noticeable in my next bit, or for the next ideology, the extreme far right. Just to highlight, that's prevent referrals, okay, in Bedfordshire. So we see that at prevent. Would also highlight for the counter-terrorism arrest figures. So they are released yearly, so they go from April to March. But last year's arrest figures, 167 people arrested for terrorist offences in the UK. That's not, doesn't sound much. Do you realise that's 3 people a week who could have committed a Manchester-style attack? You know, it starts to put sobering thought there. But the other issue about that is there was a growing demographic in one area. There were 30, and that was children under 17, 30 children last year arrested for terrorism. That didn't happen 7 or 8 years ago, 1 or 2. And those were people with family links, you know, people who had elder siblings being arrested. There is a real change in the demographic, and it's time and time again we're seeing that now. Certainly around the extreme far right, okay? We know that, as it puts there, they are a threat. And the pictures we've got there are from a group called Patriotic Alternative. They're not a prescribed organisation. They're a perfectly legal organisation. The reason we highlight that type of group, though, is they are right-wing in their viewpoint, and they have a narrative. Their narrative, and I'm going to use some, I apologise for the language, is around immigration and what they will call the invasion being planned by the global world elite, and the government's part of that, and we need to do something about it. Immigration is a topic discussed a lot now, isn't it? You know, and the far right, they're very comfortable with it. Their narrative is very clearly very anti-immigration. The danger is for groups like PA and groups like that who are legal, but they share a narrative of white supremacist groups who say, there, we believe that. And they will say to people online, if you believe, you know, they will look for patriotic alternative supporters. They will look at some of the websites around far right groups. They will spot individuals. They will contact individuals and say, if you believe that, we believe that. But our ideology tells us we should fight back. We should be doing something. And the sharing of those narratives across those groups are what the dangers are. And we've seen kind of re-emphasis of that with some far right activity, didn't we? I'm not going to make comment about the conflict, but there are far right groups, again, operating in London or gatherings, bit old school, out in public. It's not what we see now. Primarily, we see, unfortunately, like I say, younger individuals getting enticed online by these, and it's a real issue, and it's those narratives. So they are the two biggest threats to us at the moment. We know that, highlighted by the way the world works, self-initiated terrorism. What we also see, I'm going to bring it all up so you can have a read of it rather than me dally around, because it presenting is slightly different now, are the growth, and we've probably covered this before, but the new prevent guidance allows for this. It actually mentions it where it didn't before, because we'd started to see this 5-6 years ago. We'd started to see the figures alter, and what we've seen is a growth and an expansion of what falls under prevent, because we've seen different things. What we've seen over the last 5 years, like I say, the growth of the internet, is we've seen a lot of people who are susceptible to using violence. They're grieving, they're angry about something, and they go online expressing an anger. And they either get approached by people or they go and look for what they believe are causes which would support that, and they kind of latch on to groups. And some of that is with the far right. They'll go on, they'll latch on to it. They will have a particular issue. And their actual knowledge of an ideology can be quite shallow, but they'll latch on to it. So what we see from that are what we call mixed, unclear and unstable ideologies. The mixed are ones where we see people who, and I'll give you an example. I'm not talking about the current Hamas at the moment. I will mention at the end the current Hamas-Israel conflict. Well, but around anti-Semitism, we will see that mixed ideology. We will come across people who will show signs of being anti-Semitic because they're linked to kind of far right groups. But once they're engaged with, their anti-Semitism also kind of somehow allows them to explore groups like Al-Qaeda and groups like this with their anti-Semitist views as well. So their ideologies are really mixed. It can be a challenge. But what we're really looking at are people who are angry and they're looking for somebody to blame. And that's the cause they've gone for in that case. So we see mixed ideologies. Unclear ideologies are where, as we say, it's really hard to see what the ideology is as such, because it bounces around. They'll keep bouncing around, but they believe they're doing it for a cause. They're not aiming their violence at a family or friends, like I say, and they're aiming at a group, and they will target or they will jump. It's very clear, near to mixed, to be honest. Sometimes they are mixed ideologies. We just haven't spotted it. Unstable, as you can see there, but they appear to adhere to things. What we're talking about are the growth in things, and I've used just one example here, but there are other examples, and we've just used the world of incels, which I know probably been discussed before, where we've got people who misogyny in and of itself not a prevent issue. It's a form of extremism. We don't like it. You won't like it. You'll have issues you can deal with that. It's been a real issue due to the Andrew Tate phenomenon over the last year, a challenge for schools and things where you get groups of young men, young boys with kind of little groups on the internet, being misogynistic, talking about hustlers at university. It's not for prevent, but it falls into prevent in what we call these unstable parts if they drift into incel type culture. The incel culture, as you're aware, because I know we've discussed it before, unable to form relationships. Online, very much an online thing, where you get groups of young men in quite large groups, kind of reinforcing some of that. I can't get a girlfriend. Well, you won't if you're sitting all night talking to a group of other young men online who can't get a girlfriend. It becomes, but most of these young people will grow through that, but some will come stuck with it. The danger is when some of them say this is a societal issue. This is being forced to me by, again, a global elite. It drifts into sometimes a form of right-wing extremism. Yeah, it's a militant feminism dominating the world. They will find some reason where there's a cause, and their danger is if they say, I'm going to act on this, it becomes a prevent issue. So we are seeing the growth of them, and we are seeing a lot more mixed, unclear and unstable referrals to prevent. I think that's one of the things, though, where we've seen a lot of non-ideological, certainly at an initial stage reports, where sometimes we just haven't been able to really pick apart what it is. But in this day and age where people can go online, express a sense of grievance, and almost either mix or match it themselves, or just as bad, somebody approaches them and says, those dangerous words, isn't it, grooming? I know we've discussed this before. The most dangerous words in the world of grooming aren't threats and intimidation. The most dangerous words are those words, we like you, come and talk to us, come and, you know, cross over, don't tell your family and friends, come and talk to us. What are the dangers around that? We know what the dangers are, and we see some of those dangers, and we've highlighted that. You know, we've highlighted that. You know, there have been studies about the extreme far right doing it on platforms such as Discord. We know there's been a growth in that. When we talk about the internet, we're on about gaming, we're on about friendship groups, all those things. It's not just social media, it's wider than that. And we've seen, like I say, suspected Islamist groups. We know some of them will do exactly the same. They're looking for those vulnerable individuals to draw them into that. This is my concluding slide, and just to finish on this point. I've often asked, you know, what do terrorists look like? And the terrorists look like everybody. They are just part of society. If anything, they are looking younger, which is slightly worrying. But you can see this is from an old American news article. I like this picture because I don't know what a terrorist looks like, but I think it's as good as image as you'll get as where terrorists are coming from. That individual there could be any age, any gender, probably younger, but any age, any gender, any religion. You know, it doesn't say that. It just shows a young person. That person's covered. They're hiding, and they're online. They're going out and they are expressing a grievance. And the danger is somewhere, like we say, someone picks up on that and entices, encourages, grooms, whatever word you want to use, because that's what radicalization is, to go and support them. The danger is they will say, we believe the only way you're going to change this is by being violent. You know, as well as I do, in the way you work, you know, if you've got young people or vulnerable or somebody who's susceptible, they feel aggrieved, they feel angry, they feel on their own. If somebody makes them feel special, if somebody says, we like what you're saying, you're really special, why don't you go and do it? You will be adored for doing this. You will be somebody. Those dangerous, you will make a mark. You really, you know, you really will. How dangerous are those words for some people we know who are vulnerable but susceptible to people drawing on that vulnerability. That's it. We've got to my resources slide, Danny. So again, you can see a big part from Educate Against Hate. I've had put a couple of others there, but please start with Educate Against Hate. It will link into those others if need be. If you're working in education, that's the place to start. It has lesson plans, it has guidance, it's got everything on there you need. So I'm now going to stop sharing the slides, bring it back and say, folks, on a Friday afternoon, I've thrown a lot of depressing stuff at you, but any questions, comments, concerns, queries, now is the time to ask before you all head off for the weekend, because I'm sure that's what you're all thinking about more. But anything you want to ask, folks, at the moment. Was that all right for you, Danny? Is that what you were hoping for?
No, it's pitch perfect, David. I think we needed that refresher, a lot of us as well. Same message, different voice. Just to emphasise to everybody in the chat box, I've just put the link to our Safeguarding Prevent Padlet, where the Against Hate links is there. We do share that out, and we do kind of promote that as much as we can, because, like you said, it is very much tailored towards a style of resources that we can also interpret and put into our sessions, into our meetings, in our conversation. So it is very useful. It's also quite easy to navigate around as well. It's very simple. It's a very good signposting tool as well. I've used it a couple of times for things. I think we'd go amiss of using maybe a couple of minutes of your expertise, David, by not asking around the horrible situation we've got over in the Middle East around Hamas and things, and the knock-on and the ripple effects of what we're seeing at the weekend and things like that. Have we got any kind of guidance for us as educators?
Right, there is guidance. Referring back to actual guidance, there are, if you go on, there was a guidance on Educate Against Hate 2 weeks ago. The DFE did a blog about how you discuss conflict and things. So there is some written guidance. It's an ongoing issue. What I will say, it's drawn a lot of attention from the senior politicians. Normally, in the Department of Education, most of this is civil service led, but we're being very much instructed around this by the Secretary of State for Education and her team of ministers. It's something they've taken an interest in. Their main concerns are supporting students of whatever faith, if there are issues arise at an institution, and certainly at first it was, well, primarily a lot of discussions, but our students of the Jewish faith, if there are concerns, well, they upset and how the original attack took place. Since then, clearly, though, there are concerns about the conflict as a whole, and to make sure if students are concerned, they're supported around any causes or concerns they can have. And then the discussions about how, if there are differences of opinion, how those views can be expressed, and those views, and that is one of the harder parts. That's what the blog guide is about, discussing it. How do you express? The trouble is, to put it blandly, it's very easy to get drawn into, well, I'm pro this or that, almost to make a football game out of it. Can you be pro one side, anti the other? You can have conversations, and it's about balancing that so people can express their views without others being drawn into or feeling threatened or being abused by that. What we will add, though, is clearly there is a line, and it was reinforced by the Education Secretary. They sent a letter out to every school. Your sector was kind of missed out a bit because it's hard to engage with, but a letter was sent out to every school in the country by the Education Secretary, and every Vice Chancellor at a university was contacted again by the Secretary of State. And Minister Halfon, who's the Minister for Higher Education, reinforcing that support for students was in their utmost mind, but also to remind people it is a prevent issue if there is support shown for Hamas, because they are a prescribed organisation. That is different from supporting somebody like the Palestinian Solidarity Campaign or that type of issue around that. But clearly they would be concerned, and that action may well need to be taken. And we've seen that. We've seen some students who are originally higher education students who, and I wonder whether they really clearly understood what they were doing, showed support for Hamas as such rather than the wider issue. And we've had 1 or 2 arrests and advice given and other bits being taken. So yeah, the conflict is hard to manage. It's fluid, isn't it? Because it's ongoing and the dynamics change, but it's around encouraging a safe space and supporting students of whatever faith or whatever ideology or belief around that to be able to express their views, to feel safe, and to challenge where those views may be drifting towards perhaps a prevent related or concern. I know that's a very civil service stroke government reply, and that's what we have to give at the moment. That's the terrain. I will say, as we're amongst friends, I've never seen an issue capture in my team. We've over the last 6 years, obviously my team, that we've got people who speak to ministers and advise. I haven't seen an issue where the Secretary of State and our ministers have shown so much interest. We've got my team in London have got a couple of people who manage how this works, and they haven't stopped. They've been called into various meetings to reassure ministers, the education sector is doing its responsibility, because they are being asked. Certainly with higher education, is that happening?
I think thank you for that. I think, me, David, I never miss an opportunity to fly the flag for individual learning providers.
No.
All 6,000 plus of us across the country that are working with some of the most vulnerable or susceptible, dare I say, young people and adults. We have over 1,000 adults on our amazing online education. So I think at any point that could be dropped into a minister's conversation as well. It would have been nice to have been included in those kind of heads up letters as well, because as we know from past experience, David, we do work very closely, and the team in front of you are, well, they're experts in working with people who need help, and therefore they are likely to pick up on things and educate people away from a wrong choice. Hence why they're all here on a Friday afternoon paying very diligent attention to you. So
what I will say, Danny, is if you go on, it's X now, isn't it? And if you go on Twitter and just look for the Education Secretary, Gillian Shepherd, some of that is on there. All those things have gone on into the public domain. So if you just Googled Education Secretary, it's an issue I fully accept, and we do feed that back. And it repeatedly happens but they'll go to schools and universities and colleges, and they forget about this vast and expanding and growing area of education. I think part of it is one of the reasons, to be fair to them, and it's one of the issues. And I will just mention one thing on which I've about new prevent training, because there was supposed to be new prevent training under the guidance. Those of you who've done the old workshop to raise awareness of prevent, the old RAP training, all know that withered on the vine. The new guidance, and they've been looking at new training. The new guidance said there's got to be training. So there's a small team under the Home Office under a lot of pressure to do this. And they've kind of developed a model which they would hope to introduce by the end of the year. The trouble was it wasn't working too well. And the reason is, Danny, and you'll understand this far better than me, they've trialled it, and they've trialled it with some people in Bedfordshire. There are 92 slides to that presentation. And clearly that's not it. But they are saying, right, we're going to refine that, and we will have a product by spring next year. The plan will be at some point next year, you will be contacted, or we will find a way, either ourselves or the Home Office contact you. And that's where it comes back to the problem. It is there isn't a kind of a comprehensive list of organisations like yourself. The DFE don't keep one. Local authorities have got lists of schools, so we can go to schools. You know, we haven't got that, because we've been asked by the Home Office, right, when we've got this training, can you provide us with all the DSLs in the country? And we say, well, we don't keep that. It's not what the education, we don't do that as a Department for Education. So we've got to look at that. And the idea is somehow, and it will get sorted, we will support a kind of method of getting that training out. Then what the plan is, one person or a couple of people, depends on the size of the organisation, people will be invited from an organisation to go online, register online, because the details have been given to the Home Office, do that training. I'm anticipating it will be 2.5 hours. They will then have access to that training like the old RAP. That person can then take that training back to their organisation. The good thing is the other part of the guidance is one of the parts of the guidance talks about proportionality. They will be saying, right, use that training to how you see fit for your organisation. Nobody's expecting everybody to do the 2.5 hour training, but an organisation may come back and say, well, we're a large organisation, we've got 12 safeguarding needs, I'm going to train all them for the 2.5 hour package, and then there'll be an hour package which we can just do with staff or something like that. But my concern is what we're going to call spring. If that's March, April, that's not too bad. If spring is May, June, for the education sector, that's a bad time, isn't it? Because what will happen, it won't be, you know. So that will be forthcoming. We will keep you in the loop. And actually, Danny, I may they are looking, and I'll do it while I've got you, they are looking for individuals who may be willing to kind of engage with them early on to look at a model. If you're willing to do that, I'll send them your details and say, you know, here's an independent learning provider, somebody trusted and has got knowledge of it as well, done the training, and I'll put your name forward. I don't know if they'll get back to you or not. They're looking for that nationally, but certainly that will be the next step. So hopefully, folks, next year you will get some new training. Well, I can't do more on that at the moment, but that all ties into the new guidance.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, David. And as always, you know what we're about. We'll happily go forward with that and give my details over, and I'll liaise.
And that's a good thing. It's the first time, Danny, where they've been looking at this and they've actually come out and said, oh, we need some people from the independent learning providers. And it was you saying that, and I'm thinking, right, yeah, so we've been tasked with that, my colleagues and I, because we've got that network. So I'll certainly bear that in mind, mate. I appreciate that. Thank you.
No, that's great. Brilliant. Okay, so officially, thank you, David, for your time. Obviously, late on Friday
afternoon. To catch up with you.
Yeah, brilliant. Any more questions from anybody? No, you're quite
4 o'clock on a Friday, Danny. The people want to get home. They don't want to be